The memory of that evening still lingers vividly in my mind, like an old movie replaying over and over. It was dinner time, and the air was thick with tension even before my stepfather, a short, fat, and pudgy man, lumbered into the room. He had a penchant for making life difficult for everyone, especially me. As was our routine, my brothers and I had already started eating before he arrived at the table. My mother, a kind and gentle woman, had prepared a plate of heirloom tomatoes for him. The bright red slices glistened under the warm dining room light, and the thought of what was to come made my stomach turn. He settled into his chair, his beady eyes darting around the table, taking stock of everyone's plates. When his gaze landed on mine, I knew I was in for another round of his cruelty. Without a word, he stabbed a slice of tomato with his fork and plopped it onto my now empty plate. I couldn't hide the grimace that crossed my face. "I can't eat this." His lips curled into a wicked grin as he leaned in closer.
"You will eat that before you leave the table?"
I glanced at my mother, who was bustling around the kitchen, trying to avoid the impending confrontation. She had overheard our exchange but remained silent, fearing his wrath. I sighed, a mix of frustration and resignation bubbling up inside me. "You won't like what happens." My stepfather's face turned a shade of deep crimson as he balled his fists.
"What did you say, you little brat?"
My mother's voice trembled as she interjected,
"Please, don't force him to eat it. He warned you."
He shot my mother a withering glare.
"Stay out of this. Woman, it's none of your business."
I didn't waste any time. I knew I had to go through with it. I picked up my knife and fork and delicately cut a wedge of that tomato, trying not to let my distaste show. I raised the fork to my mouth and took a cautious bite. The instant that foul-tasting tomato touched my tongue, my body revolted. I tried to chew, to swallow, but my stomach had other plans. My stepfather's smug satisfaction quickly turned to shock as I sputtered and retched. In a matter of seconds, the contents of my stomach spewed forth onto his plate, splattering his round gut and lap in a grotesque display. He leaped back from the table, chair scraping against the floor as if my body had betrayed him.
"You little shit! I'm gonna beat your ass!"
My mother had seen enough. In an act of surprising bravery, she stepped forward, brandishing a knife she'd been using to slice vegetables. The glint of the blade caught the light, and her voice, though trembling, held a steely resolve.
"He warned you, didn't he? So leave him alone."
For a moment it seemed as if a standoff was imminent. My stepfather, his face flushed with anger, stared down my mother, but the knife at his throat made him think twice. He finally backed away, mumbling curses under his breath, and stormed off to take a shower. My mother's hands were trembling as she put the knife down, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She had protected me, but at what cost? I knew that her actions that night would have consequences, and I couldn't shake the guilt that welled up inside me. Days turned into weeks, and tension in our home remained palpable. My stepfather had taken to avoiding me, and I could sense the anger simmering beneath his gruff exterior. My mother tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but her eyes held a haunted look, and her laughter had grown scarce. One evening I heard muffled voices drifting through the walls. It was my mother and stepfather locked in a heated argument. I couldn't make out the words, but the intensity of their voices sent shivers down my spine. I crept closer to the door, straining to listen. My mother's voice was trembling but resolute, and my stepfather's deep baritone rumbled with anger. It became clear that the argument revolved around me, the events of that fateful dinner and my mother's defiance. I couldn't bear to eavesdrop any longer, and I returned to my room, my heart heavy with guilt. It was my actions that had sparked this discord, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought trouble upon my mother. My mother and stepfather's arguments became more frequent, and the atmosphere was suffocating. I felt like a helpless bystander in my own light, the weight of my actions bearing down on me. One evening, it all came to a head. Their voices reached a crescendo, and I knew that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I rushed to the source of the commotion, finding my parents locked in a bitter confrontation. My stepfather's face was red with fury, his eyes burning with rage.
"You think you can defy me, woman? Protecting that brat. You'll see where your loyalty gets you."
"I won't stand by while you torment him. He's just a child, and you're a grown man."
Their words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment it seemed as though the world had come to a standstill. Then, in a fit of rage, my stepfather raised his hand, and the sound of a resounding slap echoed through the room. My mother staggered backward, her hand flying to her reddened cheek. She looked at him with a mixture of shock and defiance.
That's the last time you'll raise your hand to me.
With that, she turned and walked away, leaving my stepfather seething in her wake. I watched as she retreated to her room, tears streaming down her face. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I finally saw the extent of the pain my actions had caused her. My stepfather's fury knew no bounds. He stormed off to his room, and the sound of objects being thrown and shattered reached my ears. I knew that things had reached a breaking point, and I couldn't bear to stay silent any longer. I approached my mother's room, finding her sitting on the edge of her bed, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and exhaustion. "I'm so sorry, Mum," I whispered, the weight of my guilt almost suffocating me. I never wanted any of this to happen. She reached out and pulled me into a tight embrace, her tears staining my shoulder.
It's not your fault, sweetheart. I should have protected you from the beginning.
As we clung to each other, I knew that something had to change. The storm that had been brewing for so long had finally broken, and the aftermath left a path of destruction in its wake. My mother had suffered enough, and I was determined to make my stepfather pay for his cruelty. Revenge became a constant thought, an obsession that consumed me. I began plotting in the shadows, devising a plan that would inflict upon him the same pain and humiliation he had brought upon my mother and me. It started with small acts, subtle enough to avoid suspicion. I'd misplace his car keys, swap sugar for salt in his morning coffee, and leave cryptic notes suggesting he was losing his mind. As my pranks escalated, my stepfather's frustration mounted. He became paranoid, believing our home was haunted by malevolent forces. I reveled in his torment, watching as his confidence crumbled and his sanity teetered on the edge. One evening I rigged the doorknob to his room, making it nearly impossible to turn. His desperate attempts to escape his chamber of horrors filled the house with anguished cries. I listened in silence, hidden from view, savoring my triumph. But I wasn't satisfied. My revenge had evolved into an unrelenting obsession. I devised more elaborate schemes, each more vindictive than the last. I'd play eerie sounds in the dead of night, moving objects around to unsettle him further. His sleep-deprived eyes bore the weight of fear, and his health deteriorated. As weeks turned into months, my stepfather's mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. He'd lost weight, his hair graying prematurely, and his once assertive demeanor shattered. The torment I'd inflicted upon him had taken its toll, but I wasn't finished. One evening, I staged a haunting scene, complete with eerie shadows and ghostly apparitions. My stepfather stumbled upon the macabre display and fell to his knees, begging for mercy. It was a moment of triumph for me, a sick validation of my revenge. But my satisfaction was short-lived. As I reveled in his suffering, I couldn't ignore the collateral damage my actions had caused. My mother, who had once been my partner in secrecy, now saw the extent of my cruelty and the toll it had taken on my stepfather. She confronted me one evening, tears streaming down her face.
What have you become? You're no better than him.
I couldn't bear the weight of her disappointment, and I realized that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The satisfaction I derived from my revenge had soured, and I was left with the bitter taste of regret. My stepfather, a broken man, was admitted to a psychiatric facility, unable to distinguish reality from the horrors I'd manufactured. My mother, forever changed by the trauma she'd witnessed, chose to leave him behind, seeking solace in a life far away from the darkness that had consumed our home.